All right, welcome to Chapter 47, where we put it all together. Chapter 47 is Conservation Biology and Biodiversity. In Section 1, we're going to talk about the biodiversity crisis, which is the issue that we're seeing now where a lot of rare, threatened, and endangered species are sadly dying off, and we're adding more and more species to those lists every year. In Section 2, we're going to talk about the importance of biodiversity to human life, aka why do we care about the random woodpecker in the South that may or may not be declared extinct. It's the ivory-billed woodpecker if you want to look into it. Biodiversity is incredibly important to human life, and this section will tell you why. In Section 3, we're going to talk about threats to biodiversity. So you're going to be able to identify significant threats to biodiversity. You'll be able to explain the effects of habitat loss, exotic species, and hunting on biodiversity, and then identify the early and predicted effects of climate change on biodiversity. Biodiversity is really important, and it's also really hard to measure for us. So just be aware as you're thinking of paper summaries for this week. Biodiversity literature can be kind of challenging to understand. So in Section 4, we're going to talk about preserving biodiversity. So we're going to look at new technologies and methods for saving biodiversity, legislative frameworks for conservation, the principles and challenges of conservation preserve design, effects of habitat restoration, and zoos in biodiversity conservation. And so, as I mentioned in the week video, this is what I personally work on and have worked on for about the last decade. And so I have a lot of opinions about this, but I'm going to let these unbiased videos from other folks really tell you the story about these things. I will say, before we close this final chapter summary video, that one threat to biodiversity that we often don't think about in the U.S. is forest change and logging. So the U.S. exports, the U.S. is the #1 exporter of wood products in the world for many categories. Not all the categories, but for quite a few categories. And so what we're doing to our forests is we're making them consistently younger and less biodiverse. And so that is a real threat to biodiversity. Often when we talk about threats to biodiversity, we think outside of our backyard. So we think about the rainforest or the palm oil in Indonesia. And all of that is important and critical, but I also want you to think about your own environment and the place that you live, or the place that you want to live, or the place where you grew up. And think about the threats to biodiversity that maybe aren't talked about quite as much. And then keep in mind, too, that there's this other thing that's been happening with biodiversity and conservation that's really unfortunate. And that is where folks often decide what is best for the land without consulting the folks who have lived on the land for centuries and centuries and centuries. And so we have these situations where we throw up a fence and we call it conservation, but we also kick out the people who have been living in that nature and in relationship and in that ecosystem for generations, right? And so as we approach these conservation and biodiversity problems, we really need to think also about how we're protecting the humans and respecting indigenous rights and the rights of folks who have lived on those lands for centuries prior. And so these are really thorny issues, and you'll see them in the news all the time because it's an evolving field and evolving issues, and they're all getting made worse by climate change. So off my soapbox. I hope you enjoyed Chapter 47, and I look forward to, grading your final exams, because this is the last summary video that I'm doing. Have a great summer. Bye.